Limehouse Chinatown wasn't serving General Tso's chicken in the 1920s. The real food was stranger, tougher, and nothing like you'd expect. Segment 1. Plain white rice. White rice sat at the center of every meal. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, it was always there, and everything else came in smaller amounts around it. A bowl per person, refilled when empty, eaten with whatever bit of preserved vegetable or salted fish happened to be available that day. The men in Limehouse were mostly from Guangdong province, rural areas near the Pearl River Delta. Back home, rice was the meal. You didn't think of it as a side. You ate rice, then had a little something to go with it. Chinese grocers on Pennyfields and Limehouse Causeway sold it in bulk. Long grain, usually. It came in large cloth sacks that got stored in kitchens or back rooms, lasting weeks depending on how many mouths you were feeding. Cooking was simple. Rinse it, boil it, maybe steam it if the setup allowed. No butter, no salt, just rice and water. It stretched everything. One small portion of fish could feed several men when you had enough rice under it. For someone working a 12-hour shift at a laundry, that bulk mattered, and leftover rice reheated fine, which meant dinner could turn into congee by morning. Texture was the thing people cared about. Each grain separate, not clumped. Too wet and it went gummy. Too dry and it stuck. You learned the water ratio once, and then it became automatic. Segment 2. Rice congee, juk. Leftover rice from the night before got tossed into a pot with extra water and simmered down until the grains broke apart completely. That's congee, called juk in Cantonese, and common enough that most lodging houses or small restaurants in Limehouse served it every morning. The consistency was thicker than soup, but thinner than porridge. Some people liked it watery, others preferred it dense enough that a spoon could almost stand up in it. Either way, it cooked slow, sometimes for an hour or more, and the longer it went, the softer everything became. Congee showed up when money ran low. It used rice that might otherwise go to waste, stretched it further with water, and filled you up for cheap. A single bowl could keep someone going through a morning shift, especially if you added a preserved egg or some pickled vegetables on top. During illness, congee was standard, easy to digest, warm, plain enough not to upset your stomach. Families back in Guangdong had been making it that way for generations. Cooking it required almost no skill. You just had to watch the pot and stir occasionally, so the rice didn't stick to the bottom and burn. The smell filled whatever room it was made in. Mild, starchy, faintly sweet if the rice was fresh. Some versions included scraps of fish or small amounts of pork, but in Limehouse during lean times, plain congee was more typical. It reheated well and kept for a day or two if stored properly. Breakfast one morning could become lunch the next if you added hot water. Segment 3. Steamed leafy greens. Chinese vegetables were harder to get than you'd think. Choy sum, bok choy, gailan, the greens that would have been standard back in Guangdong, didn't grow well in London's climate, and importing fresh produce from China in the 1920s and 30s wasn't practical. So people adapted. British greens got used instead. Cabbage mostly, sometimes kale or spinach if the price was right. They didn't taste the same, but steaming them worked similarly. You'd trim the leaves, rinse them, then cook them over boiling water for a few minutes until they wilted but still had some bite. A little salt, maybe a splash of soy sauce if you had it. Simple. The Chinese grocers occasionally stocked preserved mustard greens in jars, salted, fermented, sold in small portions. Those kept for months and gave you something closer to the real thing, even if the texture was different. They were salty, pungent, good chopped up and added to rice or soup. Fresh greens showed up at meals almost daily, partly because they were cheap, partly because eating only rice and preserved foods would have made people feel terrible after a while. A plate of steamed cabbage didn't solve that completely, but it helped. The British greens cooked faster than Chinese varieties. Softer leaves, less structure. You had to watch them or they'd turn to mush. Segment 4. Soy sauce with rice. There were days the money ran out before payday. No fish, no vegetables, no preserved anything. Just rice and whatever condiments were left in the cupboard. Soy sauce, usually. You'd cook a bowl of plain white rice, Pour a little soy sauce over it, mix it through so every grain had some color, and that was the meal. It sounds grim, but it kept people going. The salt and umami gave the rice enough flavor that you could eat it without feeling like you were chewing paper. This wasn't a one-off thing. For men living alone in lodging houses or working long hours at laundries with irregular pay, soy sauce rice happened regularly. It was faster than making congee and required no preparation beyond boiling the rice. Some people added a bit of lard if they had it, melted into the hot rice. It made everything richer. But that wasn't always an option. Soy sauce was one of the few items that almost every household kept on hand. It didn't spoil, didn't need refrigeration, and a single bottle could last weeks even with daily use. Chinese grocers sold it in large glass bottles, and you'd portion it out carefully because running out meant going without. The taste was intensely salty. If you used too much, it'd be almost inedible. Most people learned the right amount through trial and error. Just a drizzle, maybe a teaspoon or two per bowl. Enough to make the rice bearable, but not overwhelming. Segment 5. Salted duck eggs. Duck eggs preserved in brine could last for months without refrigeration. The Chinese grocers in Limehouse sold them individually or by the half dozen, already cured and ready to eat. They cost less than fresh eggs and provided protein during stretches where meat was out of reach financially. The preservation process turned the egg white firm and salty, almost rubbery in texture. The yolk went bright orange and took on a dense, slightly grainy consistency, nothing like a fresh yolk. Some people found the flavor too intense on its own, so they'd eat half an egg with rice rather than a whole one at once. Preparing them was dead simple. You rinsed off the exterior mud or ash coating that sometimes clung to the shell, boiled the egg for a few minutes to make sure everything was cooked through, then peeled and sliced it. The white came away in clean sections. The yolk held together but crumbled slightly under pressure. Salted duck eggs appeared at breakfast more than any other meal. A few slices on top of congee or plain rice gave you something savory to start the day. The salt content was high. One egg could season an entire meal for 2 people. Some men ate them with plain boiled water or weak tea to cut the saltiness. The shells were pale green or grey, covered in a thin layer of dried brine residue. You could tell how long they'd been curing by the smell once you cracked them open. Segment 6. Pickled mustard greens. The fermented mustard greens came in wooden barrels, imported from China and then redistributed through the Chinese grocers in Limehouse. They were packed tight in brine, salty and sour, with a pungent smell that hit you the moment the lid came off. These weren't a substitute for fresh vegetables. They were their own thing entirely. Sharper, more intense, meant to be eaten in small amounts alongside rice or congee. A spoonful or 2 per person was typical. Any more than that, and the acidity became overwhelming. The texture was dense and fibrous. The leaves had gone soft from fermentation but still had bite. You'd rinse them under water to cut the salt, chop them into smaller pieces, and either eat them cold or stir-fry them briefly with a bit of oil. Cooking them mellowed the flavor slightly, but didn't eliminate the sourness. Barrels of pickled greens could sit in a back room or storage area for weeks without spoiling. Once opened, they needed to stay submerged in their brine, or they'd dry out and lose flavor. Most households or lodging houses portioned out what they needed and sealed the barrel again immediately. The taste was polarizing. Men who grew up eating fermented vegetables back in Guangdong found them familiar and comforting. For anyone else, they were an acquired preference. But in a place where fresh Chinese vegetables were hard to come by, pickled greens gave meals a flavor closer to what people remembered from home. Segment 7. Dried mushrooms. Dried shiitake mushrooms turned up in almost every Chinese kitchen in Limehouse. They were light, compact, lasted indefinitely if stored dry, and added depth to dishes that otherwise would have tasted flat. A handful could transform a pot of plain soup or congee into something with actual substance. Before cooking, the mushrooms needed soaking, usually in warm water for at least 30 minutes, sometimes longer depending on how thick they were. The soaking liquid turned dark brown and smelled earthy, almost like wet wood. That liquid didn't get thrown out. People used it as a base for soups or to cook rice, since it carried most of the mushroom's concentrated taste. Once rehydrated, the mushrooms expanded to several times their dried size. The caps went soft but still had chew. The stems stayed tough and fibrous, so most people trimmed those off and discarded them or saved them for making stock. The caps got chopped and added to stir-fries, soups, or steamed dishes. Chinese grocers imported them in bulk, often in large tins or cloth bags. The price varied depending on quality. Thicker caps with distinctive white cracks on the surface cost more. Thinner, plainer mushrooms were cheaper but still did the job. Fresh mushrooms spoiled within days. Dried ones sat in a cupboard for months, ready whenever you needed them. That durability mattered more than most people realize. Segment 8. Tofu, fresh or dried bean curd. A few Chinese-run shops in Limehouse made their own tofu, usually in back rooms or small workshops attached to grocery stores. Fresh bean curd didn't travel well and spoiled quickly, so local production was the only reliable way to get it. The process started early in the morning, soaking soybeans overnight, grinding them into a slurry, boiling the mixture, then straining and curdling the liquid with gypsum or nigari. Fresh tofu came out pale white, wet and delicate. It held its shape, but only just. Most people bought it the same day it was made and cooked it that evening. Fried, steamed, added to soup. It absorbed whatever it was cooked with. On its own, the taste was mild, almost bland. But that was the point. Dried tofu was different. Pressed into dense blocks and left to dehydrate, it turned chewy and tan-colored. Unlike fresh bean curd, dried tofu lasted for weeks. People sliced it thin and stir-fried it with vegetables, or rehydrated it in water before cooking. The firmer consistency made it easier to handle and gave it more bite. Not every household used tofu regularly. It cost more than rice or preserved vegetables, and some men living alone didn't bother with ingredients that required immediate cooking. But for families or lodging houses feeding multiple people, tofu stretched protein further than meat could for the same price. The smell of soy milk boiling during tofu production was distinctive, slightly sweet, starchy, unmistakable once you'd encountered it. Segment 9. Salted fish. Salted fish was a staple, not an occasional ingredient. Every kitchen had some. The strong, pungent type, usually imported from China, cost more, but packed serious umami. Cheaper versions used British cod or other local catches, cured in salt and hung to cure until rock hard. The intense saltiness meant you only needed a small piece. An inch-long chunk, rinsed and steamed over rice, could season an entire pot. Some people fried it first to crisp the edges, which mellowed the intensity slightly and added texture. Preparing it required breaking off a portion with a knife or cleaver. The fish was so firm it wouldn't flake apart like fresh fish. It had to be chopped or shaved. Once cooked, it released its salt and a deep, savory funk that saturated whatever it touched. British cured cod worked in a pinch, but lacked the complexity of traditional Chinese saltfish. The curing methods were different, and the result was one-dimensional by comparison. Still, people used what they could get. One piece of salted fish could sit in a cupboard for months without spoiling. That reliability made it indispensable. Segment 10. Pork belly. Fresh pork belly didn't show up often, but when it did, people bought it. The fatty, layered cut was cheaper than lean meat and went further because the fat rendered out during cooking, leaving enough grease to flavor rice or vegetables for days after. Preparation took time. The belly got scored, sometimes marinated in soy sauce and spices, then braised slowly until the fat turned translucent and the meat fell apart. That single piece might feed 4 or 5 people across 2 meals, served with rice one night, then chopped and added to soup or stir-fried with greens the next. British butchers carried pork belly, though the quality varied. The cuts were often thicker and fattier than what you'd find in Guangdong, but they worked. Chinese butchers, when available, trimmed it differently. Thinner slices, more attention to the ratio of meat to fat. The rendered fat got saved. Spooned into jars and kept in cool storage, it became cooking oil for weeks. Nothing went to waste. Even the skin, if left on, crisped up during roasting and provided texture. A good piece of pork belly, braised until the fat shimmered, could make plain rice feel like a proper meal. Segment 11. Chicken feet and offal. British shoppers passed over chicken feet and organ meats without a second glance, which meant Chinese buyers got them cheap. Butchers often threw feet in for free or sold them at a fraction of what breast or thigh cuts went for. Liver, kidneys, intestines, same story. What seemed like scraps to one community was proper protein to another. Chicken feet required patience. After trimming the nails, they got blanched to remove impurities, then braised for hours in soy sauce, ginger and spices until the skin turned gelatinous and the tiny bones became tender. The texture was all about that sticky, rich collagen. Nothing meaty about it, but satisfying in a different way. Offal varied depending on availability. Liver got stir-fried quickly with onions. Kidneys needed soaking to reduce the strong taste, then slicing thin and cooking fast. Intestines took serious cleaning but became tender after slow simmering. Every part had its method. Wasting any edible portion of an animal felt wrong, especially during lean times. If a butcher offered you something for next to nothing, you took it and figured out how to cook it later. Frugality wasn't optional. Segment 12. Tripe and pig intestines. Cleaning tripe and intestines was the price you paid for buying them at almost nothing. British butchers sold these cuts for pennies because most of their customers wouldn't touch them. The smell alone put off anyone unfamiliar with offal cooking, and the preparation time made them impractical for households without experience. Tripe, usually beef stomach lining, came in thick, honeycomb-textured sheets. It required scrubbing under cold water, sometimes with salt or vinegar to cut the odor, then boiling in multiple changes of water before it was ready for actual cooking. Once cleaned, it simmered for hours in ginger, soy sauce, and spices until tender. The final texture was chewy but slippery, nothing like regular meat. Pig intestines demanded even more effort. They arrived still containing residue, which meant turning them inside out and rinsing repeatedly until the water ran clear. After cleaning, they either braised whole or chopped into sections and stir-fried. The membrane crisped slightly during cooking, while the interior stayed tender. Both tripe and intestines stretched meals considerably. A pound of either could feed several men when paired with rice and vegetables. The labor involved in preparation was considerable, but the savings justified it. Butchers were happy to offload what they considered waste. Segment 13. Dried shrimp small. Sun-dried shrimp packed intense seafood flavor into something the size of a thumbnail. A pinch or two added to a pot of soup or rice gave it a depth that fresh shrimp couldn't match. Concentrated, briny, faintly sweet. Chinese grocers sold them loose by weight or in small paper bags. Before use, they usually soaked in warm water for 10 to 15 minutes to rehydrate and soften slightly. The soaking liquid went straight into whatever dish you were making because it carried most of the taste. Throwing it out would have been wasteful. Once softened, the shrimp either went into the pot whole or got chopped finer depending on the dish. Stir-fried with vegetables, they added little bursts of savory punch. Mixed into congee or soup, they dissolved into the background while still contributing their flavor. Fried rice benefited from them too. A handful tossed in near the end elevated everything. They kept indefinitely if stored somewhere dry and dark. No refrigeration required. A small bag could last months, doled out a spoonful at a time. The cost was low relative to how much mileage you could get from them. The shells stayed on. Nobody bothered removing them. They were thin enough to eat without issue. Segment 14. Eggs dried shrimp lasted months. Fresh eggs didn't have that luxury, but British hens produced them cheaply enough that most households could afford a few each week. Local shops and markets sold them loose, and they were one of the few protein sources consistently available regardless of season. Eggs went into everything. Scrambled with a little soy sauce over rice made a quick meal. Beaten and drizzled into soup at the last minute created egg drop strands. Fried and placed on top of a stir-fry added richness. Hard-boiled and halved, they stretched alongside vegetables when meat was scarce. The versatility mattered as much as the price. You could cook an egg in under 5 minutes or incorporate it into something more complex. It adapted to whatever else was on hand without requiring special preparation or lengthy cooking times. Storing them was straightforward. Just keep them cool and use them within a week or two. No brining, no drying, no elaborate curing process. That simplicity made them practical for men living alone who didn't want to deal with complicated preservation methods. British eggs tasted different from the duck eggs common in Guangdong, but the difference was minor. Protein was protein. Segment 15. Soy-braised pork eggs handled weekday meals. Soy-braised pork was different. It took time. Hours of slow simmering in soy sauce, sugar, ginger and spices until the meat fell apart at the touch of chopsticks. This wasn't something you made for one person eating alone. It was for groups, for occasions when multiple mouths needed feeding. The cut mattered less than the method. Shoulder, belly, or even cheaper trimmings all responded to the same treatment. Brown the outside first, then let it braise in liquid until the fat rendered completely and the sauce thickened into something dark and glossy. The smell filled the building, rich, sweet, faintly medicinal from the star anise. A single pot could feed 6 to 8 people across several meals. The pork sat in its braising liquid between servings, absorbing more flavor as it cooled and reheated. Second-day pork was often better than first day because the sauce had time to penetrate deeper. Serving meant ladling chunks onto individual rice bowls, along with some of the reduced sauce. The sauce soaked into the rice, making each grain slick and savory. Nothing fancy about the presentation, just meat, sauce, rice. The pot usually emptied within 2 days. Whatever liquid remained went into the next batch or got saved for cooking vegetables. Segment 16. Stir-fried rice with scraps. Braised pork took planning. Fried rice was what happened with whatever was left. Day-old rice clumped less than fresh, making it easier to separate the grains in a hot wok. You'd crack an egg or two, scramble them first, then toss in the cold rice along with scraps. Bits of leftover meat, wilted greens, a few dried shrimp, whatever sat in the cupboard or icebox. The technique was fast. High heat, constant movement, everything cooked in under 5 minutes. Soy sauce went in near the end, just enough to color the grains without making them soggy. Some cooks threw in a pinch of sugar to balance the salt. Others didn't bother. Fried rice absorbed mistakes well. Overcooked vegetables, meat too small to serve on its own, that half portion of yesterday's stir-fry, it all disappeared into the wok and came out as something cohesive. The rice unified everything. In lodging houses, fried rice cleared out the odds and ends before they spoiled. Nothing dramatic, just practical. A way to make sure ingredients didn't go to waste and everyone ate something hot. The best versions had a slight char on some grains from sitting against the wok surface. That smokiness made all the difference. Segment 17. Clear broth noodle soup. Fried rice handled solid leftovers. For something lighter and faster, noodle soup. Wheat noodles were more common than rice noodles in Limehouse. Cheaper, easier to source from British suppliers, and they held up better in hot broth. Fresh noodles came from Chinese shops when available, but dried wheat noodles from regular grocers worked fine. The broth started simple. Boil water, toss in some dried shrimp or a bit of salted fish for base flavor, maybe a few slices of ginger. Let it simmer while the noodles cooked separately, then combine everything in a bowl. A handful of chopped greens went in at the end, cabbage, spinach, whatever was on hand. They wilted instantly in the hot liquid. This was speed food, 10 minutes from start to finish if you moved efficiently. The broth stayed light and clear, nothing heavy or rich. Some people cracked an egg directly into the bowl and let the heat from the soup cook it partially. Others skipped protein entirely and just ate noodles in seasoned water. Late-night cooking in lodging houses often meant noodle soup. Easy to prepare quietly, didn't require much cleanup, filled you up without feeling excessive. A pot could stretch to feed 2 or 3 men if portions stayed modest. Segment 18. Steamed fish. Fresh fish from the docks came cheap on certain days, usually when the catch exceeded what local buyers wanted or when something wasn't moving fast. Chinese men working near the Thames had first access, and a whole fish that might feed 3 people could go for a few pence if you timed it right. Steaming was the default method. You'd gut and scale the fish, score it a few times along the sides, then place it on a plate over boiling water. Ginger slices went on top, Sometimes a splash of soy sauce or a drizzle of oil. Nothing elaborate. The point was letting the fish taste like fish, not burying it under heavy seasoning. Timing mattered. Oversteam it and the flesh turned rubbery. Underdo it and the center stayed raw. Most people judged by eye. When the flesh turned opaque and flaked easily with chopsticks, it was done. Usually 8 to 10 minutes depending on size. The skin peeled away cleanly if steamed properly, revealing white meat underneath. Bones were manageable. You just ate around them or picked them out as you went. Served over rice with the cooking juices poured on top, the fish disappeared quickly. The smell of ginger and steam lingered in the kitchen for hours afterward. Segment 19. Stewed beef with ginger and soy. Steamed fish took minutes. Beef stew needed hours. British beef was tougher than what most Chinese immigrants had eaten back home. Grass-fed, leaner, different muscle structure. The cheaper cuts, especially, required long simmering to break down the connective tissue and become edible. The process was straightforward but time-consuming. Brown chunks of beef in a hot pan, then transfer them to a pot with water, soy sauce, ginger, maybe star anise or a bit of sugar. Let it simmer on low heat for 2 or 3 hours, checking occasionally to make sure the liquid hadn't evaporated. The result was meat that fell apart easily and a dark, savory broth. Brisket and shin were common choices. Inexpensive, readily available from British butchers, and well suited to braising. The fat and collagen melted during the long cook, thickening the liquid naturally. Some cooks threw in turnips or carrots toward the end, less for authenticity, and more because they absorbed the flavor well. Beef stew happened less frequently than pork or fish dishes, mostly due to the time commitment. But once made, it fed several people across multiple sittings and improved as it sat. The flavors deepened overnight, and reheating was effortless. Segment 20. Mooncakes, rare, festival only. Most food was about getting by. Mooncakes were different. They only appeared once a year during the Mid-Autumn Festival, and even then, not every household could afford them. Importing them from China was expensive, and local production in Limehouse was limited to a handful of bakers who had the skill and equipment to make them properly. The filling, typically lotus seed paste or red bean, came dense and sweet, encased in a thin pastry shell stamped with decorative patterns. A salted egg yolk sat in the center of the better ones, cutting through the sweetness with a rich, savory bite. These weren't snacks. They were carefully portioned, often shared among several people and eaten slowly. For men living far from home, mooncakes carried weight beyond their taste. They represented continuity with traditions that felt increasingly distant in London. Families gathered around them when possible. Lodging houses sometimes pooled money to buy a few for communal sharing. The cakes themselves were heavy, oily, and intensely filling. One small piece was usually sufficient. They didn't travel well and crumbled easily, which is why most people ate them within a day or two of purchase. The embossed patterns on top, flowers, characters, geometric designs, were the only decoration most people saw all year. Segment 21. Sweet red bean, paste buns. Mooncakes were out of reach most days. Red bean buns were closer to possible. When flour prices dropped or someone had a bit of extra money, these steamed buns appeared. Soft, white, filled with sweetened red bean paste. Not an everyday item, but not a once-a-year luxury either. Making them required time and patience. The dough needed kneading, then resting, then shaping around spoonfuls of paste before steaming. Some households made their own when conditions allowed. Others bought them from Chinese bakeries in Limehouse, where bakers produced small batches throughout the week. The texture was what mattered. A good bun had pillowy, slightly springy dough that didn't stick to your fingers. The filling stayed smooth, not grainy, with enough sweetness to register but not overwhelm. Eating one cold was acceptable. Eating one fresh and warm from the steamer was significantly better. Red bean buns functioned as breakfast, snack, or dessert depending on circumstance. For children growing up in Limehouse, they were treats tied to specific occasions: birthdays, good news, rare windfalls. For adults, they offered a break from the relentless savory diet of preserved fish and rice. The paste itself came from adzuki beans boiled down with sugar until thick, labor-intensive, but worth it. Segment 22. Sesame balls. Red bean buns appeared when money allowed. Sesame balls needed a reason. Weddings, New Year gatherings, significant birthdays. They required specialized skill and ingredients most home cooks didn't have. Glutinous rice flour, lotus paste or bean paste for the center, black or white sesame seeds for coating, and enough oil for deep frying. The exterior, when done right, turned golden and crispy with a thin shell that cracked under your teeth. Inside, the glutinous dough stayed chewy and stretchy, surrounding a small pocket of paste. The sesame seeds toasted during frying, releasing their nutty aroma and adding texture to each bite. Making them was fiddly work. The dough had to be the right consistency, too wet and it fell apart in the oil, too dry and it cracked before frying. Shaping each ball evenly, sealing the paste inside without tearing, rolling them in sesame seeds, then lowering them carefully into hot oil without splashing. One batch could take an hour or more. Chinese restaurants in Limehouse sometimes offered them, but the quality varied. Homemade versions, when they appeared, came from households with experienced cooks who'd been making them for decades. They didn't keep well. Eat them the same day or the texture deteriorated. Nobody made just one or two. A gathering meant dozens. Segment 23. 5-spice roasted meats. Sesame balls marked personal celebrations. Roasted meats meant something bigger. Community gatherings, festival days, weddings where entire streets got invited. The preparation happened in kitchens equipped with proper ovens or outdoor roasting setups, usually run by experienced cooks who'd been doing it for years. Duck, pork, sometimes chicken, all marinated overnight in 5-spice powder, soy sauce, honey, and other seasonings depending on the recipe. The meat hung in the oven or over open fire, basted repeatedly until the skin turned mahogany and crackled. The smell cut through Limehouse for blocks. Sweet, spiced, smoky. These weren't dishes anyone attempted at home casually. The equipment alone made it impractical. Most lodging houses lacked ovens capable of the sustained high heat needed. The spice blend itself had to be balanced precisely. Star anise, cinnamon, cloves, Sichuan peppercorns, fennel seeds, and getting the ratios wrong ruined the entire batch. Chinese restaurants and specialized shops produced roasted meats in limited quantities, selling them by the portion or by advance order. Sliced thin and served over rice, a small amount went far. The crispy skin and tender meat underneath provided texture and richness that everyday meals lacked completely. Leftovers, if there were any, disappeared into soups or stir-fries the following day. The rendered fat alone was worth saving. Segment 24. Stir-fried cabbage. Instead of Chinese greens, festival meats were exceptional. Most days meant making do with what was actually available. British cabbage replaced bok choy and gailan in nearly every stir-fry because those Chinese greens didn't grow in London's climate, and importing them fresh was impossible. The substitution was obvious to anyone who'd grown up eating the real thing, but it was what existed. The cooking method stayed the same, even if the vegetable didn't. High heat, quick movement, garlic and ginger if you had them, a splash of soy sauce or oyster sauce near the end. Cabbage wilted faster than Chinese greens and released more water, turning soggy if you weren't careful. You had to work faster, drain excess liquid, keep everything moving. The taste was blander. Cabbage lacked the slight bitterness and mineral quality of proper Chinese vegetables. It was serviceable. It filled the plate. It provided something green alongside rice and whatever protein was available that day. But nobody pretended it was the same. British greens cost almost nothing at local markets, which made them practical despite their shortcomings. Kale occasionally showed up as another substitute, slightly closer in structure to Chinese greens but still noticeably different. The adaptation was functional, not ideal. You worked with what London offered. Segment 25. Tea with condensed milk cabbage wasn't the only British ingredient that became routine. Tea did too. Chinese immigrants had always drunk tea, but the British style, strong black tea with milk and sugar, crept into daily habits. Condensed milk replaced fresh milk because it kept indefinitely without refrigeration and provided sweetness alongside creaminess. The preparation was simple. Brew the tea strong, add a spoonful or two of condensed milk, stir until the liquid turned pale brown. Some men drank it that way throughout the day, particularly those working long shifts who needed something hot and energizing. The sugar content gave a quick boost, and the ritual of making tea provided brief pauses in otherwise relentless work. Chinese tea, green, oolong, pu'er still appeared in households and restaurants, especially during meals or social gatherings. But British-style tea with condensed milk became the workhorse beverage. Cheap, accessible, familiar to both Chinese and British palates. Lodging houses kept tins of condensed milk and bags of strong black tea on hand constantly. The taste was intensely rich and sweet compared to traditional Chinese tea. Drinking it throughout the day probably contributed to tooth decay, but that concern took a backseat to practicality. Hot, sweet tea got you through the shift. That mattered more.